지금부터 코리아 비전 컨퍼런스 2012의 두 번째 세션을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 이번 세션은 녹색성장위원회 양수길 위원장님께서 좌장을 맡아 금융위기 이후 아시아 및 한국 경제의 부상을 주제로 발표와 토론을 진행해 주시겠습니다. 네, 양수길 위원장님 진행 부탁드립니다.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to this conference, and specifically to this Session 2 on the rise of Asia and the Korean economy after the crisis. As the session chair, I think I have two primary responsibilities. One is to keep you awake in this first session after lunch, and I will do my best by stimulating discussions. And my second responsibility is to keep time. And I think in this regard, I face a challenging responsibility. Now, in the previous session, we heard the views of distinguished experts on the state of the global economy after the global financial crisis, as well as on the risks and challenges it poses for the Asian and Korean economy. In this session, we will discuss the prospects for the Asian and the Korean economy in the context of the post-crisis prospects for the global economy we have discussed in the earlier sessions. And for this purpose, we will listen to two presentations by two most distinguished speakers. First, the presentation on the Korean economy. Minding the fact that the purpose of this conference is, after all, to assess the prospects for the Korean economy, as well as identify the challenges and policy agenda for Korea. And then we'll listen to a presentation on the Chinese economy, which focuses on the prospects for macroeconomic rebalancing of the Chinese economy as a development that will have crucial bearing on the global economy as well as on the Korean economy. Now, the presentation on the Korean economy will be made by Dr. Randall Jones, sitting on my next left, who is the head of the Japan and Korea desk in the OECD Economics Department. Dr. Jones has been at the OECD since 1989 and has written 13 OECD economic survey of Korea and 10 such survey of Japan. So I bet that there probably is no one in this room who knows better about the Korean economy as Dr. Jones. And I'm not sure if Professor Taka Ito from Japan would know as much about the Japanese economy than Dr. Randall Jones over here. Now, Dr. Jones earned his degree at the University of Michigan. He has worked at the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors, Japan Economic Institute, and the U.S. Department of State before joining the OECD. And the presentation on the Chinese economy will be made by Professor Yu Yongding of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which is often goes by its acronym CAS. And Professor Yu is sitting on Dr. Jones's left. And Professor Yu concurrently serves as the Director General of the Institute of World Economics and Politics and as President of the Chinese Society of World Economics. And Professor Yu graduated from CAS first, earning his Bachelor of Science and Technology degree, and then earning his Master of MA degree in Economics, and then he earned his doctoral degree in Economics from the University of Oxford. And Professor Yu is well known to many of us around the world, and especially to Korean economists, for his numerous publications in macroeconomics and world economics. And those two presentations will be followed by comments by two authoritative discussants. First, we will hear comments from Mr. Richard Dobbs, who is a director of the McKinsey Global Institute, which is McKinsey and Company's economics and business research arm. Now, unlike all previous directors of the McKinsey Global Institute, or MGI, who were based in the US, Mr. Dobbs chose to stay in Korea to direct McKinsey's operation in Korea. So there must be something nice about Korea which keeps him here. Mr. Dobbs received his BA in Engineering, Economics and Management from Oxford University in UK, of course, and an MBA from Stanford Business School. And he has written profusely on corporate finance and valuation, among other things. And then we will hear comments by Dr. Jung Gu-hyun, a professor of economics at Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, or KAIST. He earned his PhD in business administration from the University of Michigan, and then he served as a professor of business management at Yonsei University during 1978 to 2002, which amounts to something like 24 years, I think. And then he moved on to Samsung Economic Research Institute as its president and CEO, where he catapulted this institute to an economic and business think tank of an international fame. And then he left SERI, this institute, to join KAIST as professor in 2011. He wears a number of hats, other hats, including that of the president of the Seoul Forum for International Affairs. Now, I propose a social contract among all those in the room, especially among us, on time sharing as follows. We have about 70 minutes to share in this session. And I invite the two presenters to speak for about 15 minutes each, if that's okay with you. But then you will have later opportunities to speak again. And then I will invite the two discussants to speak for about 7 minutes each during the first round. And after hearing the two discussants, I will give Mr. Jones and Professor Yu a few minutes each to respond to those comments. I will then open the floor to the audience and invite up to, say, a few questions, maybe 3 questions, each for not more than 1 minute. That's very important. And then I will give 1 minute or so to each of the 4 speakers on this podium so that they can respond. And then I might intervene from time to time to facilitate the flow of discussions. And then I will conclude the session. So without further ado, may I invite Mr. Jones to come to the podium.
안녕하십니까? 제가 이 한국 비전 대회를 참석할 수 있어서 감사합니다. 현대 경제연구원에 감사드립니다. 그리고 한국경제신문 감사드립니다. 제가 1974년 한국에 처음에 왔습니다. 그래서 제가 한국에 방문을 할 때마다 제가 한국의 경제적인 변화를 느낄 수 있습니다. 그래서 제가 한국의 비전에 관해서 생각하면 제가 항상 한국 계속 방문하겠다고 생각합니다. 한국말 부족하니까 제가 영어로 말씀드리겠습니다. First of all, as in 1997, Korea recovered very rapidly from the 2008 crisis. We see a huge drop in output in the final quarter of 2008, and that reflects Korea's reliance on exports, followed by a strong recovery in 2009. And this expansion has continued, although we see it slowing down again in 2012 with the world economy experiencing some difficulties. This recovery was led by exports and industrial production. Many countries in the OECD, including Japan, have not recovered their 2008 peaks for production and exports, but Korea recovered by 2009 as it continued to grow. And the strong export growth was supported by a weak won. As Professor Ito mentioned, the fall was especially sharp versus the Japanese yen, which is very important for certain exporters in Korea. So the economy's in the midst of a recovery that is ongoing. And looking ahead, I'd like to think about convergence. Korea in 1970 had a per capita income of only 12% of the U.S. Level. By 1997, it was up to half. Then we had the Asian financial crisis. Following a sharp downturn, Korea has continued to converge towards the level of the advanced countries. Relative to Japan, Korea is now up to 90% in terms of per capita income. But looking ahead, Korea faces 5 important challenges I'd like to briefly talk about. The first is population aging. Population aging in Korea would be the most rapid of any OECD country. In 2010, Korea had the 3rd youngest population in the OECD, but thanks to due to the very low birth rate of about 1.3, by 2050, Korea will have the 2nd oldest population in the OECD. So in other words, the aging process will be the most rapid of any OECD country. This implies a significant fall in the labor force. The working age population, 15 to 64, will start to decline in 2016. If participation rates stay constant, we'll go from 26 million workers to less than 22 million by 2050. But this is very sensitive to participation rates. And if female participation rates were to rise to the same level as men, the decline would be much smaller, as shown on this graph. Now, we like to try to explain differences in income by labor inputs and productivity. And this graph looks complicated, but simply on the left side, we have per capita income differences. And as I mentioned, Korea is about 37% below the U.S. In terms of labor inputs, Korea is far and away the country with the largest labor inputs, about 40% more than the U.S. on a per capita basis. This reflects very long working hours in Korea. Working hours in Korea are about 2,200 hours per year, compared to about 1,500 hours in France, where I live, or about 1,800 in the U.S., where I'm from. So Korea has very long working hours, but in the future, these labor inputs are going to fall because working hours are falling. The government has a target of cutting them to 1,800 hours per year by 2020. And as I mentioned, the labor force will fall. So this big labor input is going to start shrinking in the future. To offset the shrinking labor force, the government set a target to raise the employment to population ratio from 63% towards 70%, which would match Japan. To achieve this target, it's very important to increase participation of groups that aren't fully utilized in the labor force. The key thing is the female participation rate. For women between 25 and 54, the rate was 62%, the 3rd lowest in the OECD area in 2010. Another problem is the labor mismatch problem, which for the youth, we have a very low participation rate for youth, even if we adjust for the fact that many are still in college. I like this quote by President Lee Myung-bak, who said, "Reckless university enrollment has aggravated both the private education budget and youth unemployment." And third, we need to extend the employment of older workers in firms. The average retirement age is only 57, even though life expectancy in Korea is now up to 80 years. And so we need to take better advantage of the human capital of older workers. First, regarding women, the key factor in my view is the problem of labor market dualism. When a woman leaves the labor force for marriage or childbirth and they want to come back, they usually face the option of non-regular work. And that's not very attractive given the low wage and the precariousness of non-regular work. The second issue is childcare. And of course, the government's doing many things on this. Even as we speak, things seem to be happening. Work-life balance is very important. As I mentioned, long working hours make it hard to have 2 parents working in the same household. And the questions of maternity leave and childcare leave are also important. On the issue of older workers, I think we need to move away from mandatory retirement. Many workers even leave well before the mandatory age, and because companies are anxious to get rid of them because the steep seniority wage profile makes them unprofitable. So as they get older, their productivity starts to level off or even go down while the wage keeps going up. So we need to move away from seniority-based wages towards performance-based wages. Let me move on to the second topic, which is the service sector. And this is a key problem in Korea. In fact, in the terms of Mr. Zelik, it's a reason for the middle income country trap. In Korea, the service sector is relatively small compared to other OECD countries, and productivity per worker in services is only about half of that in manufacturing. Whereas in the OECD as a whole, in panel C, you can see the average worker in services has productivity that's about 86% of manufacturing. So Korea has a world-class manufacturing with world-class companies. On the other hand, it has a service sector that is relatively unproductive. And this is reflected over time, the deterioration in service productivity and wages. In 1991, service sector wages were almost equal to manufacturing wages, but by 2009, the gap had risen to almost half. So this shows the deterioration in the service sector over the past 20 years. So going back to this chart that I showed before, on the right-hand side, we have productivity per hour worked. So there you can see that the productivity gap between Korea and the U.S. is almost 60%. So this is largely explained by services. So for Korea to converge and to reach the level of income in the most advanced countries, at the same time while labor inputs are falling, this means we have to raise productivity, especially in services. We're fortunate to have Mr. Dobbs with us today. I know we've done lots of work on services, and when we were talking about this a few months ago, we talked about this for probably 5 or 6 years now, but not much has really happened. So I think it's important to stress again some of the issues, some of the policies that might help the service sector in Korea. First of all, there's the issue of trying to level the playing field. Manufacturing has traditionally benefited from certain advantages, lower tax rates, lower electricity rates, and it's time to make the playing field level between manufacturing and services. We need to strengthen competition. It's a question of entry barriers, regulatory reform, competition policy, and also reducing barriers to trade and FDI. In terms of FDI, Korea is a relatively closed economy. FDI, the stock of FDI is 13% of Korea's GDP. That's the third lowest in the OECD. If you look at the service sector, the stock of inward FDI is only 6% of GDP. The OECD average is 37%. So having more foreign direct investment in services is one way to have more competition and higher productivity. And finally, we need to address the problem of SMEs who are predominantly located in the service sector. And over time, we've seen more and more government assistance given to the SMEs, more and more loan guarantees, more and more subsidies. But nevertheless, the performance of SMEs has tended to deteriorate. Let me turn now to the third issue, which is social cohesion. And this is really a front-page issue not only in Korea, but in my country and in Europe and Japan as well. The question is rising income inequality. Korea traditionally was a relatively equal country in terms of inequality until about the mid-1990s. But since then, we've seen a sharp rise in inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient. So now, compared to the OECD average, Korea's inequality is slightly higher. In terms of relative poverty, which we defined as an income below half the national average, Korea's poverty rate has also risen. And in terms of OECD countries, Korea's poverty rate is now the 7th highest, just after Japan. So this has become a very important political as well as economic issue. The poverty rate is especially high for elderly people. In Korea, if you look at the 66 to 75 age group, the poverty rate is 3 times higher than for the general population. So that means almost half the people over 65 live in relative poverty. In the OECD as a whole, the 66 to 75 age group has a poverty rate that's slightly below the national average, which reflects their well-developed pension systems. In this area of social cohesion and income inequality, I think there are 4 main topics. And the first is labor market dualism. In Korea, this is kind of hard to see perhaps, but about 1/3 of employees are non-regular workers. That means they have little employment protection. That means their wages on average are only 57% as much as regular workers. So this creates inequality in the Korean economy, in the Korean society. Companies hire non-regular workers, according to polls of companies, for two main reasons. One is to save money because they cost less, lower wages. And the second is because they need employment flexibility. And that means when the economy has a downturn, companies want to have fewer workers. And given the fact that regular workers are very costly to lay off or to fire, companies hire non-regular workers to provide flexibility. So the option, how do we solve this problem? It's not a very politically popular option, but we need to reduce the employment protection given to regular workers so that we can have this flexibility without relying on this non-regular workforce. In terms of temporary workers, most countries don't have this idea of non-regular. Japan has it as well, but most countries don't have it. But if we compare the share of temporary workers, Korea is very high. And this is not only a problem for equality, it's a problem for economic growth, because in Korea, on-the-job training is very important. Companies train their workers on the job. But if you have a temporary worker, you tend to be, there's no incentive to train them. So companies will tend to not train them, and that lowers Korea's growth potential. On education, let me move quickly through this, but the main point is in Korea, the private cost of education is very high, and we have the problem of hagwon. And hagwon are very expensive, and I talked to my Korean friends. It's one of the reasons people don't have as many children, because they worry about how to pay for hagwon. It creates inequality because children's educational results depend partly on if they're able to go to hagwon. And not surprisingly, attendance at hagwon and money spent on hagwon goes up with household income. And children's economic or educational performance goes up with hagwon. So we really need to resolve this problem of hagwon. Let me turn to the fourth issue quickly, which is public social spending, which is how most countries address the issue of inequality. Social spending in Korea is about 8% of GDP, compared to OECD average of 20%. Now, the reason it's low in Korea is because, as I mentioned, Korea has a relatively young population. That means less spending on healthcare, less spending on long-term care, less spending on pensions. As Korea ages, this 8% will converge towards 20% as in other OECD countries. So Korea needs to be careful in adding new social programs, because if we don't do anything, we're going to end up at 20%. And everything extra will take us beyond that level. So social spending is very important, especially for certain groups like the elderly, but it's an area we need to be cautious. Korea has managed to maintain a low level of debt, about 33% of GDP, compared to the OECD averages now is 100%. And it's very important that Korea keep a strong fiscal position with low government debt, partly because of aging and partly because of the consideration of North Korea. Korea also has low taxes. This is because of low spending, and this low tax rate encourages people to work. People work a lot in Korea partly because they keep what they make. They have a low tax rate. And as spending goes up, we need to avoid the situation in Europe where the tax rate goes up to 40, 50%, and people decide to take more leisure. Let me just finish quickly with green growth, given that Mr. Yang Soo-gil is with us today. I can't finish without talking about green growth. Since 2008, this has been the strategy announced by President Lee Myung-bak. And this presidential committee was established in 2009. And Korea has a target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 30% relative to a baseline as usual by 2020. This is an ambitious target, implies a cut of 4%. And fortunately, Korea took the very courageous step of passing an ETS, thanks to the work of Dr. Yang, of passing ETS which will take effect in 2020. And Korea's economic development will depend on how effective and efficient this green growth program is. They've started a program, a 5-year program that spends 2% of GDP, a huge sum of money towards green growth. And this will help determine Korea's economic future as well. Let me just finish with one slide that shows North Korea. This is hanging over everybody's head in terms of, for example, keeping a strong fiscal position. North Korea is half the population of South Korea, but the per capita income in Korea is much, much lower at only about 5%. And this has to be kept in mind as we think about Korea's future. So let me close here, and I'll look forward to answering any questions later on. Thank you very much.
So may I now invite Professor Yu to the podium on the Chinese economy.
It's always a great pleasure to be here, to see so many old friends. And I want to make one correction. In your introduction, you use present tense. Actually, almost all should use past tense. Okay, this is one correction. Thank you, anyway. My talk is about the global financial crisis and China's rebalancing. When we are talking about China's rebalancing, actually we mean two things. One is external imbalancing, another is internal imbalancing. Here, I would like to talk about external balancing first. Then, if I have enough time, then we'll talk about China's external imbalancing and how China is trying to correct those imbalances. And, oh, sorry, this is not the right PPT. I changed another PPT because I try to concentrate on Chinese economy, not this one, please. Actually, I prepared two PPTs, but let me see this one. No, not this one. Sorry. And this morning, I installed the yes, I think this is right. Yes, this is the right one. And from this charter, you can see that China's current account surplus to GDP ratio has been dropping rapidly. When we are talking about China's external imbalance, actually people are talking about China's huge current account deficit, surplus, especially current account surplus to GDP ratio. You can see that in 2007, before the global financial crisis, China's current account surplus to GDP ratio was as high as 10%, even higher for some economies. Then, after the crisis, this ratio has been dropping. And why? You can see this China's export and import. Because the most important component of China's current account, of course, is China's trade account. This is from 2006 until recently, before crisis. China ran very large export. GDP ratio is very high, and also import over GDP ratio also very high. So the growth rate of this is growth rate. The growth is tremendous. You see, in some year, the growth rate is something like 40%, 20%. 20% is norm for China to maintain a growth rate of export as high as 10%. At the same time, China's growth rate of import is also very high. So I think Korean and other East Asian countries have benefited greatly by this increase in China's imports. But now situation has changed. This is figures in 2012 up to last month. I try to update this data as recently as possible. You can see this is a very sharp contrast with the China's previous export performance. Then why we have this sort of changes? According to most Chinese economists, and also in line with the IMF report. Perhaps this report is to a certain extent based on Dr. Li's reporting to IMF. So broadly, we agree with this conclusion. And China's reduce in its current account surplus to GDP ratio actually is attributable to following four factors. One is worsening the external environment. Second is worsening the terms of trade. Third, domestic stimulus package. lastly, RMB appreciation. And according to IMF, the fall in China's current account surplus to GDP ratio does not represent the rebalancing in China. And the paper predicts that China's current account surplus to GDP ratio will rebound in 2013 and approach to a pre-crisis level thereafter. This is also IMF's conclusion. But unfortunately, I don't quite agree with this prediction, even though I agree with their analysis of the causes about China's fall in its current account surplus to GDP ratio. Why I have some doubt about IMF's reporting on this, just because I think after so many years RMB exchange real appreciation, the impact bound to be quite big. You see, since 2005 up to now, RMB has appreciated in real terms by more than 30%. As a result of this appreciation, in coastal areas, you can see quite few enterprises actually went bankrupt. And there are tremendous incentive for lots of Chinese enterprises to upgrading the infrastructure, to improve their technology, so on and so forth. And lots of Chinese enterprises shift their focus production from external demand to domestic demand. Even though this process is slow and maybe still in the beginning, but this process is ongoing process. So far, China's export shares in major markets in the United States, in Europe, and many other countries actually hold quite well. You haven't seen very dramatic fall of this share. But you cannot argue that RMB appreciation failed to have any impact on China's export drive, because lots of Chinese enterprises lower their prices in foreign market. Competition is very heavy. As far as I know, some of very important Chinese enterprises actually increased their export in volume term, but in value term, their export now is in a very, very dangerous situation. It's going to shrink. So I think this kind of price cutting will not support China's export drive. China's market share in major foreign markets will shrink as the result of RMB appreciation. Another very important factor now is becoming more important is wage increases. This, I think, has begun a few years ago. Now, the speed of increase actually is very rapid. I was a member of an advisory group for 5 years plan. According to China's 12th five-year plan, from 2010 to 2015, the average growth rate of a minimum wage will be no less than 13%. 13% actually is very rapid. And there's a definition, what is minimum wage? That is 40% of average of certain provinces or certain regions. So we have a very clear definition about what is the minimum wage. This minimum wage have to increase by 13% over 5 years' time. This is very important. And also there are lots of other benefits workers now can get. So the consequences of the increase in labor cost on China's trade balance will be shown more clearly in years to come. Even now, some enterprises are still holding up by cutting prices and so on. But the labor cost is increasing very rapidly. And lots of enterprises now are complaining the drop of profitability. The profit margin has been low. So in order to survive, they have to cut the production. Then it will have a serious impact on China's export driver. And of course, when we are talking about China's imbalances, And when we are talking about one of the most important reasons for China's external imbalances is China's high saving rate. Then most people will attribute this high saving rate to China's lax social security system. This judgment was correct. But at the same time, we should see that over the past few years, the Chinese government has speeded up the improvement of China's social security system. Here are some examples. The number of people covered by basic old age insurance for urban residents almost universal. For example, in Beijing, if you don't have work, but you are Beijing resident, you register, then you have a minimum wage. This minimum wage should have no problem whatsoever for you to survive and to lead a quite decent life. This is something we can't imagine in the past. And also we have quite good employment insurance. Works compensation, maternity insurance also in place. And more importantly, perhaps, 1.3 billion urban and rural residents are covered by basic medical insurance. Maybe the money is not big, but they cover even a poor farmer. Their basic medical insurance covered. This is something very important. And anyway, China's social security system really improved gradually. In recent years, accelerating, the pace has been accelerating, which bound to have an important impact on China's saving investment gap and also China's current account surplus to GDP ratio. Then another issue, which I think IMF raised is very good and call Chinese to pay attention to this issue. Actually, we have been discussed the issue more than 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but people ignore this issue. That is terms of trade. Terms of trade has been worsening steadily. And I think this has something to do with China's economic structure and also has something to do with some investment fever. Invest in real estate fever also. But fundamentally, I think this has something to do with China's place in international production networks. As I point out in this slide, China has to export more manufacturing goods to get the same value for energy in mineral products. So Australian and other countries benefit greatly. So this is a sort of a reversal of a single privilege thesis. According to them, different countries, if they export raw materials, your terms of trade is bound to worsening. The China situation is just opposite. But I think this perhaps is inevitable if China fails to readjust its economic structure. Here is a figure provided by IMF. I'm very grateful for them to provide this figure. You see this green line. This is mineral products. China run huge deficit. China run trade surplus in products such as machinery, family appliances, this sort of thing. But in many important commodities, China actually is running huge deficit. I don't think we can change this trend in the foreseeable future. And another very interesting thing is about China's investment income. We know that Japan now is running trade deficit, but at the same time, Japan is running investment income surplus. This investment income surplus is much bigger than Japan's trade deficit. So Japan is still running current account surplus. China, of course, running trade surplus and current account surplus. But the funny thing is that after so many years running current trade surplus, current account surplus, after accumulating so much net foreign assets, China has been running investment income deficit for many years. So I don't know what will happen in the future. You export real resources, your products and so on, but you run investment income deficit. That's something we should worry. not at this moment, but in the long run. So some of implications of this situation can be shown by this factor. By running account surplus, China accumulated 4.7 trillion foreign assets. You can think 5 trillion. China has 5 trillion assets. At the same time, because China running current account surplus for many, many years, we attract FDI and so on and so forth. China accumulated something like 2.9 trillion foreign liabilities. You can think roughly 3 trillion. So 5 trillion minus 3 trillion. China basically run 2 trillion net foreign assets. We are net creditor. We are lending money to United States and other countries and so on. But instead, getting interest from those borrowers, we pay interest to them. So assume that interest rate is 3% by such huge net assets. Then China should receive at least 30 billion investment income each year. But instead, last year we paid 27 billion US dollar investment income to United States and many other countries. So this position is very peculiar, but not really surprising. This is a mirror image of how much dark matter. United States export dark matter. They use foreign money for free for many years, according to Hausman. From 1981 to 2005, roughly U.S. used 5 trillion foreign money for free. But who provide this money? I think number one, Japan. Number two, China. Maybe Korean. But definitely now number one is China. So we should do something to change this situation. Not conclusion yet, you have time. I talk a little bit about Chinese internal. Okay, very quickly. Okay, all right, okay. What I'm trying to say is that currently China is also facing serious internal imbalances. One of the most important characteristics of these internal imbalances is China's very high investment rate. China's investment rate is something like 50% of GDP, extremely high. And also, among this 50% of this investment rate, the biggest investment is in real estate development. China's real estate development investment account for something like 9.9% of GDP or 10% of GDP. I cannot see any country which have this kind of experience. A country's growth cannot based on cement and steel and so on. Cement and steel helpful, but it will not make your country's growth sustainable. So you're bound to cut this investment rate. If you cut this investment, of course, the growth rate will drop for a certain period of time. I think, fortunately, the Chinese government now is very wise. They actually are very hesitating whether to reintroduce another stimulus package. If they want, they can, because China's fiscal position is good. But eventually, we have to face this problem. We have to speed up internal adjustment, make this economic structure more reasonable so that it can be more sustainable. Then there are other issues I will talk with you in Q&A. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the report that China's rebalancing is making good progress. Now, Dr. Jones has used 20 minutes, Professor Yu 17 minutes. Now I invite Richard Dobbs and then Professor Zhang to come in as discussant. Richard? You will love listening to his British accent. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's a British accent, and unlike normal, I'm not turning up with the hundreds of McKinsey slides. You've seen the slides from the previous people, so I'm going to discuss some points. I think with both Professor Yu, Randall, and actually our conversation this morning, it is evident that there are three very successful strategies that have come out in the last crisis. There are three ways that countries have done very well. There is the the Korean model, which is to have a over-indebted banking sector. The banking sector, capital flows out of the country. When the crisis happens, the capital flowing out of the country results in a sharp drop in the currency. Competitiveness gets restored, and the country exports its way to growth. That's the Korean model. There's the China model, which is you pile up foreign reserves like anything, keep your currency weak, keep your competitiveness, export your way out of the crisis, do very well. And we heard this morning the German model, which is you tie yourself in a monetary union with a set of fiscally irresponsible countries. That keeps your currency weak. It allows you to export your way out of the crisis. Now, I'm being slightly facetious here, but there were 3 very successful models. All 3 countries have done very well. In the end, we'll see how much the Germans end up paying for the benefits they've received. I don't think it's going to be cheap in any way. There may be a delay before they end up paying it, but it's going to be an expensive bill. As Professor Yu has shown, the Chinese model has proved to be expensive. Instead of them getting income on this money, they're actually losing money in terms of the US are using it to borrow and then reinvest back. So I think the Korean model may have actually been a very successful one. And we should look at Korea and say there was something that Korea did well on the currency. And actually, let's be honest, Korea got lucky. This was a very good piece of luck. And I was very involved with a number of conversations with very senior people, both in the Blue House and government, during the week where the currency collapsed most. And at the time, it certainly didn't feel as if Korea was on track for something good. It felt like a real crisis, and many people in Korea at that point viewed the currency as the ultimate vote of confidence in the country. And when the FT had that full-day page, that sinking feeling on the Wednesday, their full 1-page thing on Korea, it certainly felt as if we were in a major, major problem. Looking back on it, that was the best week for Korea in terms of the crisis, the weakening of the currency, particularly given the, as Professor Ito mentioned this morning, strengthening the yen at the same time, the yen-won cross rate going from 7.5 to 16 at one point back to 14, really helped the competitiveness of Korean companies against their Japanese peers, and it's been very good. But let's be clear, despite things that people have said afterwards, this was luck. Korea got lucky, and the bad news sometimes when people get lucky is they forget that they got lucky because they were lucky. They think that there was something that was good inherently behind it. And Korea, it was lucky. Korea does have a lot of very good things, which I'll come on and talk about in a minute. But I think it's important to remember that getting lucky, you need to use the opportunity. And I think Korea has used the opportunity in some ways on the luck, but I think Korea has not used the opportunity to take some of the reforms that are going to be necessary to project the country to the next level. And I think Japan hasn't made that opportunity either, as much as they need to, so it's not as if the major peers are necessarily doing it, but a crisis can be a good opportunity to do that. And that's about the changes that are required on fertility and the changes that are required on the service economy. There are a bunch of other issues that Korea faces. This whole economic democratization, which I think part of that is an election game going on, but I think part of it is real. I have no worries that Korea can't address that. Korea could cope with unification with North Korea. There are a lot of things that Korea is able to do. But I think the issue on the service economy and the issue of fertility are going to be much harder. And the reason they're going to be much harder is that the root cause behind them actually ties in with why Korea is a success. So let's take the fertility one. And we're doing some research trying to get behind a bit more detail of what's the real cause behind this fertility. But the 2 big ones behind why Korea has this falling fertility, and Randall showed you the economic impact of this. The 2 root causes are the work intensity and the educational arms race that Korea's mothers particularly participate in. Now, the work intensity, Randall showed the numbers. I compare McKinsey offices around the world. We are the hardest country in terms of hours here in Korea. Randall's numbers shows this is true for everywhere. That does have a high correlation, at least the stuff we're beginning to see, between low fertility. If people are having to work very, very intensely, there is, a lot of evidence beginning to emerge that that's one of the root causes behind that. However, that work intensity is one of the reasons that Korea is successful. Why is it that Samsung Electronics were able to go from being very, very behind in smartphones to now outselling Apple in that short period? Why is it that some of the other great successes in Korea, the shipyards that are able to turn it around, the engineering firms operating in the Middle East, how is it that they're able to do it? It's because the Koreans in the teams that work on those things work very, very intensely, very, very hard. It's the big source of advantage that the country brings. To unpick that and to remove some of that runs the risk of, while it may address the fertility issue, it removes the source of greatness for the country. And I think that's the challenge of how that works through. Similarly, the education arms race. There is an education arms race happening within every Korean family. Every Korean family wants to have better educated children than their next door neighbor or their cousins. They want the children to be better educated than the cousins. I think reforming the night school system may get there, but it's just going to be, like trying to deal with the arms race by saying we're going to cut off chemical warfare. It'll go into nuclear. It'll go into other forms. More goose families. More families where the children are going to be sent abroad to be educated. And that's, I think, again, going to be part of the challenge, because this intensity and belief in education is actually at the heart of Korea's success. So I think reforming the night schools and removing some of that and maybe improving the state education, allowing more private schools will help. But the education arm race will still be there. It will be expensive because people will still pay the most expensive thing, even if it's a matter of sending children to study overseas. And that's going to cause the same issue. So the challenge on fertility, and fertility is the big issue, because if that doesn't get addressed, in the long run, Korea is going to really face a lot of problems. If the fertility issue can't be addressed, it's going to be very hard, but that requires getting at the heart of some of Korea's big successes. And that's a similar thing with the service industry. I think when I talk to a lot of people in Korea, the service industry is very misunderstood. When you talk to people, they think of services as either Goldman Sachs or people running 20-seater restaurants. And the point about this is that actually that's not what Korea is ever going to be good at. When we talk about the service industry, there's a lot more that can happen. Goldman Sachs operates with multiple people, lots of different nationalities, global business in every country around the world, exploiting the network, people collaborating together, a lot of things that really don't play to Korea's DNA. If you look at the small restaurants, they're fantastic. But, none of the Korean mothers want their children to go off and run a small restaurant. So that's, again, not going to have the talent going into it. But I think the good news is that actually there's a lot more of the service sector that I think Korea could be very good at. In fact, Korea already is good at. If you go to the Middle East, and I was there a few months ago, and I spent some time with Saudi Aramco, the largest company in the world. When it comes to them talking about a new petrochemicals plant or a new whatever, it's very clear that the only people really they view as serious contenders, or almost the only people, are the Korean engineering firms. Lotte, GS, Samsung. Those are the places that they would go to for their engineering. So Korea already has pockets. One of the reasons I've stayed in Korea when I was asked to lead the Global Institute is that you've got one of the best airports in the world. And it is a joy flying from here in comparison to flying from Heathrow Terminal 3. It's a very good place to try and fly out of. That is a service industry, and it's very well operated, and Korean Air is a very good. So the types of services, and I think this is about an important mindset, is it's not about Goldman Sachs, it's not about restaurants or burger bars. It's actually about the type of services where the capabilities that work within Professor Jung's former colleagues at Samsung apply in manufacturing, or Hyundai apply in their car plants. It's taking those capabilities and applying them to service. It's about service operations rather than classic services. And I think we already have many examples of that in Korea. So to get to the root problems and to address this, and for Korea to have the same level of growth going forward, or the same sort of outperformance in comparison to peers requires getting back and addressing some things. The service sector, I think, can be addressed, but it's a matter of changing mindset to understand about service operations and to go after that. But I think more importantly, the longer-term issue on volatility is going to require some quite deep conversations about, can we go after some of these things that have actually made us great and find ways of modifying them, working on work productivity so that we work just as hard but maybe fewer hours, working on immigration and getting more people into the country, but still getting them to fit within our very strong culture, which is how we manage to get things done very effectively here, and get that to happen. And that's going to be quite a challenge. And if we can do that, though, as a country, I think Korea can become a very successful next wave. And there's nothing that I think that I've seen here that could stop Korea going on and, in terms of GDP per capita and those types of measures, becoming at a par with countries like Germany and the United States. Thank you.
Richard, one small question. I would appreciate having your very quick answer. Can you explain your statement that Koreans were lucky with our currency movement, probably right after the global financial crisis? Could you explain that we were lucky with our currency? You said that there was a luck element with our exchange rate policy.
I think, first of all, there was a lot of unhappiness about the currency movement.
Yeah.
And I think at the heart of that is many Koreans felt the currency was a vote of confidence in the country. So prior to the crisis, when the yen won was getting to 7.5 and the yen was getting to sort of below 900 against the dollar, people felt, this is great, we're very popular, people want to invest in our country. When the currency fell, everyone said, we're unpopular, we're failing. And I think that was a mistake mindset. I think that currency is an appalling way to measure a country.
Now, Professor Chong, please.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure for me to join this conference. My comment will mostly on Dr. Jones' presentation on Korean economy. And I find Richard Dobbs' comments also very much in the same area that I'm going to make a comment. Next, please. Oh, okay. Now, I'd like to have a somewhat long-term view that economic performance of Korea in the last 60 years, really a big success story. And I think this is an interplay of institutions, policy, and people factor. But after 60 years of peace and prosperity, success factors breeding the seed of dissatisfaction. And Richard Dobbs just mentioned long working hours is actually a key to Korean success, because that very important element of so-called fast-to-follow strategy. But working long hours, you have less time for leisure, and that makes you not so happy. So our current problem is our increased income is not translated into happiness. And statistics show after your income passes 20,000 per capita, your per capita income and happiness correlation goes down. So we are at the stage where how can we change our policy and lifestyle to become more happy? And I guess the current presidential election, candidates talk about welfare policy and economic democracy, and this is exactly, I think, our politicians are reading that Korean society and economy are entering the stage where we try to realign our economic success with personal happiness. Now, I follow Randall Jones' approach, and I have also 5 challenges for our economy. And first one is how to maintain the growth momentum. Every indication is our economy is slowing down. Global recession, population dynamics, stagnating investments, and so forth. But for our population and also for the anticipation of North Korea's collapse and so forth, I think we should maintain growth momentum for at least one more decade. And this is, I think, the biggest challenge, especially in this presidential election year. Very few politicians talking about economic growth. So I think that's the number one challenge. Oops. And number two, everybody talks about service sector, but I agree with other presenters that the service sector is the key sector for Korean economy in the next decade, because the growth and employment should come from the service sector. But one thing we should remember is that currently our full employment, we have a very low unemployment rate of 3%. That's full employment. That full employment is made possible by very low productive service sector, because 25% or more of the workforce are in the self-employed and family workers in the subsistence level, the service stores. So, and this is kind of, currently the service sector is our social safety net, that when you quit job at the age of 50, 55, you don't have the good enough pension system, and only option in many cases open to you is open up stores. And that is why we have such a huge, large number of people working in the very low productivity retail stores. So we have to understand that currently service sector, although it's not that productive, is a very important factor in our society. But no question that the growth should come from the service sector. And here, any industry to develop, you need good investment and good people. And in the service sector, our problem is many regulations prohibiting investments and people flowing into and those sectors. And most prominent example would be medical service. Currently, in our medical service industry, only doctors can open and operate hospital, and only MPOs are allowed. And we should change this. We should change, and we should let profit organizations to enter the medical service. That will increase the flow of more funds to the medical service, and also not necessarily doctors, but the better talent in management. But currently, it's not possible, and the government has trying to change this, but there's a very strong organized effort to block this. So in the next administration, this should be, for example, one of the high priorities for the next administration to change this. And what we should do is to appoint a Minister of Welfare and 보건복지부, Health and Welfare, and he should promise that he will change this and step down. And I can give you many other examples, and all these industries I listed here, for example, travel. This is booming, but there are many regulations which make it less profitable to invest in hotels, for example. So service sector, relatively easy, because you change the regulation, but very difficult socially because there are many interest groups blocking that happening. Population aging, this was mentioned by Mr. Jones. And as you know, Korean baby boomers were born 1955 to 63, and they are now 50 to 57 years old. And currently, our retirement age is average 57, so our baby boomers are beginning to retire. And what we should do is to extend 10 years of our retirement age, at least to 65 in the near future, which will solve some of the decreasing working population.
Professor Chung, can you conclude in 2 minutes?
In a couple of minutes, okay. And fertility rate, important, but actually I have a question to Richard Dobbs. Okay, our current fertility rate is 1.2, something like that. But let's say if we increase that to 1.7, but it will take 20 years for those kids to become working force. So fertility rate, is a very, very long-term issue. And in the meantime, we need some other policy instruments to tackle this issue. Welfare policy, I would skip this. I think this is a key challenge for us now because of the election. Too many welfare programs without proper the revenues are discussed. Lastly, economic democracy, and this is a most controversial issue in the current presidential election. Economic democracy means different things, but currently the key is how to tame the power of Jebel. And we can have a long time to discuss, but I like to point out that when we have this discussion on governance of Jebel, we have to think of whether are they still filling market voids or are they hindering market development. And for example, risk capital. And everybody talks about future growth industry and how Korea can find risk capital to invest in those uncertain industries like bio and renewable energies. And at the moment, we don't have well-developed risk capital market, and these big businesses are the main source of our risk capital. So we have to think about, okay, what should we do about it? And I think we should be very careful in trying to change the business structure. We should respect past dependence, and we should not neglect the business culture and leadership the characteristics of these business groups. So my recommendation is go very gradually in changing this kind of corporate structure. Thank you very much.
I'm afraid that the discussions are getting really interesting, but we have already run out of time. So I want to condense the remainder of the proceeding in this session in the following way. I will spend, before inviting the two presenters to respond to those comments, I will make my own comments for 1.5 minutes. And then I will invite up to 3 interventions from the floor, and then I will give the floor to both of the speakers. As for me, first of all, one question to Randall, and thank you for that nice list of the challenges that Korean economy faces. Now, you've been reviewing the Korean economy every year. My question, has this list in terms of content changed over time? The point in my question there is this: are we making any progress at all on those laundry lists? And one thing about opening the services, and Professor Chung said that, okay, about the medical service, why don't we appoint a minister in the next administration who promises to open the market? I don't think you are touching the root of the problem. The reason why the government of Lee Myung-bak, which has been trying hard to do so, but it has not been able to open the medical service sector to commercial investment, is because there is this public sentiment against the big conglomerates. And these NGOs and the civil society and general folks do not like the idea of chaebol or business conglomerates making investment into the medical services. So I think at the bottom of the whole thing is this resentment and the negative feeling about the chaebols. So we have to do something about people's perceptions about chaebol or change the chaebol itself, I think. So about that, I would like to have your opinion, Randall. And Professor Yu, I want to ask a question outside the context of your presentation. Geopolitical tension has been rising very rapidly in Northeast Asia recently. Now, my personal assessment is that that is not going to clear up very soon. Do you think this can possibly have negative, serious impact on economic transactions in Northeast Asia? And finally, to Richard, I liked your very interesting analysis of the cause of low fertility in this country. But a question, and then you said that you think that we Koreans can handle this issue of economic democratization. Are you sure? Please, you know. Now, let me invite some questions and comments from the floor. Please raise your hand. Okay, you are all falling asleep. So no intervention from the floor. Well, thank you for actually, you are helping me to save time here. So may I now invite Randall and then Professor Yu to respond to those comments, please.
First, on the question of fertility, it's a very serious issue, but I would like to talk about two bright spots. One is that on the education, the arms race on education, in 2008, 82% of high school graduates went on to university, which is way too high. Last year, 72% went on to university. And I think maybe with the economic crisis, people are becoming more realistic that the key thing is to get a job. And we know that about 40% of SMEs have labor shortages. So maybe people in this new economic climate are thinking, rather than getting a degree which may not be worth very much in the marketplace, maybe it's better to get a degree, a vocational degree or something that will get me a job. So there might be signs of some change in the education. On the question of long working hours, I think there's a definite trade-off between hours and productivity. I think when you work 2,200 hours a year, that puts a penalty on your productivity. I know when I work too long, my productivity goes towards zero or even negative. And I know when I go to a government office on an early morning on Monday or Tuesday, people are very tired and they don't seem to be doing very much. So maybe if we worked less, we'd be more productive. In France, as an example, they had a 39-hour week. They cut it to 35, and basically wages stayed the same, and productivity managed to go up enough to keep companies profitable. So I think it is possible when you cut hours to raise productivity to offset it. But I think this is a long-run problem. Like Professor Jung said, it won't help for the next 20 years, but look about 2050. If we continue on the path we're on, there will be one person working for one retired person. And when you have a pay-as-you-go pension system, that means that one person working is going to have a huge burden, which will discourage him from working. And so even if we have a 20-year investment in more children, by 2050 we'll have a healthier situation. On the very interesting question of Dr. Young, I guess back when I started doing these surveys, we worried about basic issues of chaebol. Are the chaebol viable? Is the banking system viable? We worried about the basic solvency of the corporate and the financial sector in Korea. So I think we've seen great progress, and nowadays we don't worry about the banking sector in Korea being viable, and we know that chaebol had been great success. So over time, our issues have shifted from the chaebol and the financial sector towards this long-run issue of aging, for example. And another problem is that as the chaebol became more efficient and Korea became more open after 97, there was more competition, and companies became more interested in having non-regular workers. We have more inequality. So in one sense, the inequality we're facing now is a result of becoming more market-oriented after 97. So that brings us we solved one problem to some extent, but we have a new problem. And finally, on the chaebol, I was kind of a different voice when I first started doing these surveys. We had the Korean government with lots of regulations covering the chaebol, everything they did. And I said, these chaebol people are too smart. They'll find one way to get around each regulation. They're not going to work. What we need is more competition to force them to become more efficient in what they do. And the chaebol have changed. They have debt equity ratios of 500% in 97. Now it's done 100%. So the chaebol are much different. Now the issue to me is more of a social issue. Are they preventing SMEs from expanding? And that's a much harder issue. So, but I think, again, if the more the chaebol are forced to compete, the less we'll worry about them going what we call unnecessary diversification that crowds out SMEs. So I think the key is even more competition, more pressure, more for direct investment, pressure for takeovers that will make the chaebol become even more efficient than they are now.
I don't think I'm the right person to answer this question because I'm not a scholar of international political economy or international politics.
But you represent the Institute of World Economics and Politics.
Was, not now. But actually, I don't intervene the activities or that part of my institute. But anyway, I have my view, but not very specific. I think, yes, if really this dispute will carry on, even worsening, of course, it will have an impact, firstly, on Sino-Japanese economic relationship, and also because Sino-Japanese economies are so important in East Asia, then it will have impact on East Asian economy. But I say if your scenario is right. But I think I'm not that pessimistic about finding ways to solve this problem. We faced this kind of problem before. Maybe smaller, but fundamentally the same. We solved those problems. So I'm not that pessimistic. Then I think we should notice, or we should emphasize that, especially as economists. After 30 years, economic cooperation, economic integration, economic force will have a great impact on solving political issues. I'm very confident about this. This is why the world still needs economists.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big hand to this answer by Professor Yu Yongding about geopolitical tension in Northeast Asia. Thank you. Now, I'm going to give 1 minute each to Richard and Professor Chung. Do you have anything to add?
Well, I'm going to come back to this issue about...
1 minute. Okay.
1 minute, about economic democratization. First of all, I think this is an 80% issue around the election, a 20% reality. And the reason I say that is that if in the end, when I talk to every Korean, even if the ones who are biggest advocates of economic democratization, you say, would you ever do anything that harms Hyundai at the expense of Toyota? Or would you do anything that harms LG at the expense of Sony? And they say, obviously not. So there's a lot of the Koreans' view this is about the election, but there is a few root causes that do need to be addressed. First of all, I think there's a little bit about the way the families work. And I think there's an element about as the families move towards generations that needs to be addressed. I think there's an element of the SMEs are being starved of talent. Back to this economic education arms race, Korean mothers want their children to work at Hyundai and Samsung and the Ministry of Finance. They do not want them to work in SMEs. And so there's sort of, but that's actually not the chaebol's fault. That's more the way that the culture works. And it's going to be hard to go after that. It's going to be hard for the chaebols to sell businesses. One of the ways you get a vibrant SME sector is you do management buyouts. But the problem is that, people who joined the chaebol are working for a big, chaebol. They're unhappy with the idea of being sold off to a private equity firm or management buyout. So I think there's a bunch of those things. But in the end, the thing about Korea is this is a country where, when it's under threat, pulls together. And so there's been a lot of noise against each other, but as we saw in the IMF crisis, and we saw about these other points, when the country comes under threat, things go together. And I don't think anywhere, any Korean, including the current politicians that are doing a chaebol bashing session, would ever do anything that would harm the competitiveness of the Korean chaebols when it comes to their international competitiveness.
Okay, that's a very interesting insight. Professor Chung, please.
Two comments. One about the working hours. True, Koreans are still working 400 hours per year more than OECD average, but over the last 8 years, 200 hours less, right? So very rapidly, Koreans are working less hours, and I think we may be able to keep up with our productivity until we work 200 hours more than OECD average. Another point about the hospital, the medical service industry, very complex. But in the end, I think the current interest groups are blocking the entry of new actors. And currently, we have an oligopoly of 5 medical centers in the Korean medical industry. And 2 out of those 5 are linked with the big business. So, chaebol entering the medical industry, that's not the issue. So we should do this. We should do this. Thank you.
Forgive me for spending 1 more minute before concluding the session. I was in a cabinet meeting where President Lee Myung-bak was telling then Minister of Health and Social Affairs, Jin, the lady, to agree to open the medical service to investment. She wouldn't say anything. She just kept mouth shut and didn't say anything. She would not listen to the president's order. I think behind her is this big interest group against this. Anyway, talking about working hours, I think we should also think about working hours of what kind of work. Now, I spent about 3 years, as some of you might know, in Paris as ambassador to the OECD, and there I observed that I didn't see many Parisians seem to be working hard. I saw them mostly at cafeteria, restaurants, drinking cafe and wine and so on. So I wondered, how come they make more money than Korean workers who work to death on the factory floor? Over time, I realized that they are, while drinking coffee and drinking wine, they were engaged in work. They were thinking about designing of a car, fashion design. And if only you come up with a nice, wonderful design, one a year, you become hugely rich. So it's the kind of work that I think which matters very much here. So with this, thank you very much for your attention, and I'd like to invite you to give a big hand to those speakers on the panel, please.
네, 양수길 위원장님 감사합니다.